Today's daf we're going to be learning is Bava Batra Daf Kafav. Today's daf is sponsored by Judy Schwartz in honor of. Today's daf is sponsored by Judy Schwartz in honor of her daughter Rina. Rina got me started on my journey of daf Yomi with Hadran. You're a magnificent person who does incredible chesed for Am Yisrael and serves as an example to all of us with love and admiration for who you are. Okay, we're going to get started with our daf. Two short announcements. One is Zoom classes the last Zoom class will be this Thursday for the next month. And then we'll be taking a break for about a month from I guess it's the 26th or something of July until probably around the 28th of August. I'll update closer to the end of August when we'll get started back on Zoom. Thank you. It's the 25th I guess I was saying when we're going to start our break. Right. What I meant to say was from the 26th and on, there won't be Zoom classes from Friday. Class will go up very early, like at 5 a.m. So anyone who wakes up early, or if it's late night by you somewhere else in the world and you want to learn earlier, you'll be able to do that for the next month. And reminder that I'll be in Chicago on the 31st. If anybody wants to come to the Shiur, it'll be at 7 p.m. The details, you can email us and we'll send you details. Okay, with that, we'll get started. Didei Bar Marion. Okay, where were we? We're in the middle of the Mishna about distancing a tree from your friend's pit. And then we talked about Rabbi Yosi, who says, according to Rabbi Yosi, everyone's allowed to do what they want in their own field. But we then modify Rabbi Yosi as saying, as long as it's not like you're shooting direct arrows, which again, we've been trying to define as we go along. Each suga kind of adds another level of it. We talked about it has to be kind of immediate damage. And from your direct actions, although we did talk about there could be indirect damages even within that. And today we're going to have another issue about this Rabbi Yosi opinion, because we do actually hold like Rabbi Yosi, that you're not obligated unless it's somehow a much more direct kind of you're affecting your action, okay, already caused the damage. So didei Bar Marion, Birei de Ravin, okay, the house of Bar Marion, which we had before, if you remember, they were a wealthy family. And now we learn that the sons of Ravin, when they would be combing their flax, the parts of the dried parts, kind of like the chaff of the wheat, so the chaff of the flax, so those pieces would go flying and were damaging people. Now, how did they fly? From what? By what? The wind, right? In other words, there's number one, the action of the person combing, but then the wind blows it to the neighbor's field. So they went before Ravina, the neighbors, and said, hey, they're damaging our property, our stuff. Amar lahu, ki amrina moda Rabbi Yosi b'giri didei. So came Ravina and said, listen, when we said that Rabbi Yosi agrees that if it's your direct arrows, you're obligated, that's now. Here, it's true they're doing a direct action of combing the flax, but that's not what's causing the damage. The damage is caused by the wind that's blowing it. I didn't say that is considered giri didei. That's already not direct arrows. Matkefla Marbar of Ashi, but Marbar of Ashi says, I disagree with that. It's the direct action of the combing that then, with the help of the wind, is causing damages. That is considered giri didei, or it should be. Rav Ashi says, Marbar Rav Ashi says, because, right, that's the son of Rav Ashi. How is that different from the malacha, if you remember from Shabbat? In laws of Shabbat, we have a malacha, it's called zoreh, winnowing. How do you winnow? You separate the wheat from the chaff. How do you do it? You lift it up with this big pitchfork, and what happens? The wind comes and blows the chaff away. If it weren't for the wind, it wouldn't happen. There would be no malacha. And yet, you're obligated in the malacha anyway, even though the wind is helping you to make this happen. So, Marbar Rav Ashi says, I don't understand why it's any different than winnowing. And there in in laws of Shabbat, you're liable on the Torah level for this action, which was your action together with the wind. So, I would think that you're obligated. And in fact, they said this in front of Mereimar, Amar Lahu, and he said to them, this case is in fact just like Zoreh with the wind helping. Therefore, when you comb your flax, you know the wind is going to come and blow it. That's considered, or it's just part of the action. That's considered direct action. Now, the question is really about Ravina. So the Gemara asks for Ravina, Mishna. So now, according to Ravina, they want to ask this other question. But before we even get to the Gemara's question, there's another question you can ask on Ravina, which is, so how does Ravina understand it with the wind, right? The Ravina doesn't think it's like Masechet Shabbat. So the commentaries try to offer explanations because the Gemara doesn't. So that's when the commentaries jump in and say, well, let's try to figure out what was in Ravina's thought process. Why did he think that this was different? Now, if you remember, Bava Kama especially, we had this, and certainly when we learned Masechet Shabbat, Bava Kama was at least more recently, we compared all sorts of actions for damages and then how it relates to the same action relating to Masechet Shabbat. And in Shabbat, we always say you need melechet machshevet, you need a creative action, has certain criteria that aren't necessarily the same criteria as damages. And you could say here that melechet machshevet, now when I do zoleh and the wind helps it, the whole idea of zoleh and the creative action of zoleh evolves the wind, right? There would be no point to be zoleh if there was no wind and it wasn't going to separate. So the definition of zoleh includes the wind, and that is the melechet machshevet, which is what the Torah forbids, because it's your action plus the wind. Whereas in damages, if the whole issue here is giri didei and your own arrows, by the way, giri didei and giri didei, it uses those words interchangeably. Sometimes it says didei, sometimes didei, it means the same thing, your own. So there, the criteria is your direct actions and not the wind, right? The wind is a different issue. So that's like something else coming in. First of all, you weren't intending, and this idea is going to also pervade the next question, which is, my intent wasn't to have the chaff blow over into your area, and certainly not to damage you. That wasn't my intent, that the wind blow it. It just kind of happened as I was combing, but it wasn't part of my intent. Okay, so now they're going to ask now it's interesting because we did learn Adam Muad Olam, you're always responsible, it doesn't matter. But here we're talking about a different issue here, which is how much do I have to prevent something from getting to somewhere else? And the answer is, according to Rabbi Yosi, if I'm doing it in my own territory, I don't have to go that far. So that would be already too far. And now the Gemara asks a different question on Ravina, but I think it's really connected to the same issue, which is, Ravina, Mishna migetz hayotze mitachat hapatish v'zik dechayav l'shalem. Now here they're comparing it not to Shabbat, but they're saying, why would it be any different though than when I'm hammering and I'm building something and I hammer and a spark comes out, and from there it blows into your property and damages? In that case, I'm obligated to pay. So why there am I obligated when, again, okay, now this is a good question, whether it's the wind that goes, or really it's really a projectile. From when I hit it, it blows with a projectile of, you know, the force that I put upon it. But the Gemara seems to view this, we didn't understand laws of physics. I mean, not that I understand them so well either, but from a simple understanding, I would think that the blow of the hammer actually caused the spark to fly. But they think that the wind is involved in the flight of this spark. And therefore, why would I be obligated there and not obligated here when the wind blows the chaff of the flax? So the Gemara answers an interesting answer, which sounds a lot like things we learned in Masechet Shabbat, which is Hatan nichale deleza. Hacha lo nichale deleza. In the case of the spark, I want the spark to go as far away from me as possible, because if I'm hammering and it creates a spark and it makes a fire in my own property, I definitely don't want that there. So I want the spark to go as far as possible, and therefore it's in my interest that the spark go far, and therefore, even if it wasn't me who, I somewhat directly caused the spark to be created, but not necessarily to fly over to your property, but since I want it to get out of my property, I'm actually obligated. Whereas in this case, it's just chaff. I don't really care about it. It's not going to do anything in my field. You know, it might damage you because in the blowing of it, you know, and then the force of the wind blowing it, it might damage. But if it just falls on my property, it's not going to bother me. I mean, it's messy garbage, but it's not really going to bother me. So therefore, I don't have an interest in getting it into your field and getting it out of my field. Therefore, I'm not obligated. Okay, so here we had some interesting discussions about how much the wind is a factor, not a factor, and you know, with this opinion of Rabbi Yosi, where he says giri didei, again, trying to define what is considered giri didei and what isn't. Now we move on to a new Mishna. Lo yita adam ilan samuch l'sdei chavero elim ken urchik mimenu arba amot. Another thing, I have to distance my tree from your border 4 cubits. Why? Okay, we're going to see in the Gemara, because you might want to plow, and you need 4 cubits in which to plow. So I have to leave you space. If I put my tree there, I'll be blocking you from plowing in your own territory. Okay, this would be for vineyards where you would need a plow there, and this would be for fields with trees where you would need a plow. So I have to distance my trees or my vines from your field, presumably of trees or of vines, although we're going to have to define this line a little differently later. That would be this law. But if there was a fence between my field and your field, we're assuming the fields are open. It's just a border between yours and mine, but really you can plow into mine, I can plow into yours. But if there was a fence, we can each put it up against the fence, okay? Because I can plant my tree right near the fence. I don't have to worry about your plowing, because you're not going to plow anyway. There's a big fence. Your plow's not going to get into my territory. Now we're talking about a different issue. I plant my tree next to, right, 4 cubits away, maybe less, whatever, let's say there's a boundary there. But then my roots go into your field. There's a different issue. Now, you are worried that when you're plowing, it's going to get stuck on my roots. So what does it say here? If you don't want the machresha as the plow, you don't want your plow to get stuck on my roots, so you're allowed to dig up my roots 3 tvachim of depth into, from the ground of your territory. Now, if you wanted to dig a pit or a ditch or one of these, right, different types of ditches, and then you need a lot of depth and my roots are in the way, you're allowed to, because again, you're in your own property. Even if it might ruin my tree, my roots are in your field, you're allowed to dig my roots and dig them up. Now, when you dig up my roots, the roots are made of like a tree kind of materials. They're calling them tree, right? The wood chips of my roots. Who gets to keep them? They're his. Okay, who's his? His, the one who dug them out, or his, the original owner? The Mishna is very unclear. We have no idea. We're going to have to get back to this question later. Who gets the roots? Because they belong to the owner of the tree, because they're the owner of the tree's roots. Again, they're not going to be roots at this point. They're just going to be little twigs, but they can be used for all sorts of things. And this shows how much they were into recycling, right? And not, I don't think they were worried about all the global destruction and all that, but the environment, but they just were very resourceful and they used everything for whatever purpose they could find. So they get to go back either to the original tree owner, or maybe because they're in your property and you're digging them up, maybe you get, the owner of the land gets to keep them. So now we get to the Gemara on this Mishna, and we're going to go section by section. Tana. So the first thing is, why do you have to distance the tree 4 cubits from your friend's field? This is to allow you to work in your vineyard or your field of trees. You need to be able, or maybe you even had a field of wheat and you want to be able to plow. So we have to leave the 4 cubits. Amar Shmuel, came Shmuel and he said, by the way, I'm qualifying this Mishna. Lo shanu ela be'eretz Yisrael. Aval b'Babel shtei amot. This 4 cubit measurement is only in Babylonia. They had wider plows. It's only in Eretz Yisrael. But in Babylonia, they had narrower plows. And 2 amot was sufficient for the plow to get through. So in Babylonia, it was only 2 cubits. And in fact, Tanya Namihachi, here's a braita to support this reading of Shmuel. Because the braita says, Lo yitad amilan samuch l'stei chavero ela im ken urchit mimenu shtei amot. The braita says you have to distance it 2 cubits, the exact same halacha in our Mishnah, but 2 instead of 4. And then they said, well, doesn't our Mishnah say arba amot, 4 cubits? Ella lav k'dish Shmuel. Does this not prove Shmuel? The fact that we have these 2 contradictory sources from the tannaitic time period would seem to prove Shmuel, that one is Bavel, one is Eretz Yisrael, Shema Mina, and that's what you can infer from here. Now remember, even though the majority of Jews didn't live in Babylonia, there were Jews living in Babylonia, and there were Mishnayot and Tanaim that came out of Babylonia. So it could make sense that one source was talking about Babylonia and one was about Israel. Some have a whole different version of how this sugya came about. It's the exact same content, and we've seen this before. The first version is Shmuel qualifies the Mishnah, that it's only in Israel, and then, but not in Babylonia. Babylonia would be 2. And then we said, oh, let's prove it from the fact that we have this contradiction. Some people say that it worked the reverse. First, there was contradiction, and then Shmuel resolved the contradiction by differentiating Babylonia and Israel. And then his whole motivation was coming out of the contradiction. And it's not that we bring the contradiction to prove his point. That's how we got to the whole thing in the first place. So some people say that it was a contradiction in the first place. The Mishna says, don't plant a tree next to a field of your friend unless you distance it 4 cubits. And then they said, but Hatanya, isn't there a brayta that says 2 cubits? So Amar Shmuel, and then Shmuel, in coming to resolve this contradiction, came up with this distinction, Israel, Babylonia, Lokasha, Kamba, Bavel, Kamba, Eretz Israel. And that's how he resolved it. So it's just 2 different versions of getting to the same content. Now we're going to have some stories of situations that happen, and we're going to see all other sorts of issues that come into play here. Rabbi Bar Hanan, Havale Hani Dikle, a mitzvah de Pardesa de Rabbi Yosi. Rabbi Bar Hanan had palm trees that were right on the border of the field of Rabbi Yosef. Okay, the Rabbi Yosef was a Pardesa. Pardesa is usually an orchard, but what it really means is a vineyard. We've seen the Pardesa often is used as a vineyard. Havu ate tzipore. Now we're going to talk about a different issue. The trees attracted birds. Okay, they came to the trees and yatve bedikle, they hang out perched on the palm tree. And from there, nachte bepardesa umafzedeli. Once they were in the area of the palm tree attracted them. Once they were attracted by the palm tree, they then saw all the grapes and they ate all the grapes. Okay, I happen to have grapes that grow in my garden and I almost never eat them because by the time they're ripe, the birds have eaten all of them. Okay, so basically what Rabbi Yosef was claiming is, why did the birds end up in my vineyard? It's because of you, because they saw your palm tree, they perched on your palm tree, and that brought them over to my vineyard, and they're eating my grapes and destroying them. So Rabbi Yosef wants to make the owner of the tree responsible for the damages. Amarle, what he really says, actually, he doesn't really say you're responsible for the damages. Okay, maybe you would call that indirect. But zil kutz, but cut your tree down to prevent future damage. Amarle. So Rabbi Bar Hanan says, look, I already distanced it exactly what the law says. The Mishna says 4 cubits from your tree. You can claim it's causing you damage, but I kept the halacha. I did exactly what I was supposed to do. The Mishna said 4 cubits, distance from your neighbor's field. That's what I did. What are you bothering me about? Amar le, to which Rabbi Yosef says, you didn't understand the Mishna. And apparently we didn't either. Because what does he say? Note. That's from trees to trees. If I had trees, it would be one thing. You'd be right. But if you have your tree, you have to distance it more than 4 cubits from my vineyard. To which Rabbi Bar Hanan says, but doesn't the Mishna say, echad fanim ve'echad kolilan? Says this is true for trees, this is true for vineyards. Sounds like, right? Tree to vineyard, vineyard to tree, tree to tree, vineyard to vineyard. It sounds like all those possibilities. Amar le, Rabbi Yosef says, no, you didn't understand the Mishnah. When the Mishnah says whether a tree or whether a vineyard, what it means is hanimile ilan li ilan, or gfanim li gfanim, as we call in other areas, havalacha, min bimino, this type with its own type. If it's tree to tree, 4 cubits. If it's vine to vine, 4 cubits. But if you're going to do tree to vine, about for exactly this reason, your tree is going to attract the birds, it's going to eat from my vine, and otherwise they wouldn't have come to my vine. So you have to distance it even more. He doesn't say how much more, but he says you have to distance it more, and you didn't, and therefore cut down your tree. So sounds like he's got Rabbi Bar Hanan into a corner, and sounds like he's right. But Rabbi Bar Hanan pulls out another card. He says, Amarle, ana lo kayatz. Sorry, but I'm unwilling to cut it down. Why? Da'amar Rav, because Rav says there's another problem. What's the problem? It's a fruit-bearing tree. You might remember there's a pasuk in the Torah that says that you're not allowed to cut down a fruit-bearing tree. And not only that, but Amar Rav says about this halacha, at what point, what considers a tree a fruit-bearing tree? How much fruit does the tree have to bear for it to be a fruit-bearing tree that you can't cut down? It's forbidden to. Hi dikla, detain kava, if it's a palm tree that produces 1 kav, which is not a lot, it's a volume measurement, right? That's not so large. 1 volume of dates a year, that's already forbidden to cut. And furthermore, he says, even if you want me anyway to cut it, because you say, maybe you're not supposed to cut it, but if it's causing damage, maybe you would. But I'm a Rabbi Hanina, but I'm not unwilling to do this because Rabbi Hanina said, Lo shachiv shichcha beri. The reason why my son Shichachat died was Ela dekatske enta below zimne. Okay, this is what he thought, is that his son died young. His son must have died young because I cut down a fig tree before its time, which is a reference, obviously, to the son dying before his time. And what he's saying is, what does it mean to cut out a tree before its time? It means before it stopped bearing fruit. In other words, it was in its prime, as we say. And interesting. Ela dekatske enta below zimne. You think it's that's interesting. Okay. Ruth is saying that it's the father, it's the son that cut it down. I thought it was the father that cut it down, and that's why his son died. I don't know, maybe there's both interpretations. It again goes to who's the subject of that. It doesn't tell you who the subject is. Let me check one thing. Okay, maybe the son did it. Okay, so it's possible it's the son. Okay, the point being that if you cut down a fig tree before it's time, you might die. Okay, it's really considered something that's a little bit dangerous territory to enter into, right? This is, people often try to give reason, right? It's the necessity to kind of understand why a son would die before his time, right? It's always a very challenging situation to be in, like how it doesn't make any sense. So he tried to connect it to this event that the son had cut the tree, and therefore, mar ini chale lekot. So he says to Rabbi Yosef, if you want to, you can cut it. I'm not cutting it. Okay? Do it at your own risk. So basically, Rabbi Bar Hanan is saying, well, you might be right that I should have distanced my tree. I didn't know. I didn't understand the halacha properly. I might have, you might be right that a tree has to be distanced from a vineyard, but since it's a fruit-bearing tree, I'm not willing to cut it because there's a whole separate issue going on here. If you want to, feel free to do it and do it at your own risk. And that's where the story ends. They don't even tell us what happened, whether Rabbi Yosef was willing to cut the tree, wasn't willing to cut the tree. I imagine he wasn't. Otherwise, we probably would have heard about it. Okay, now we're going to have another back and forth between two rabbis. Okay, this time I don't know if Rav Bar Hanan was a rabbi or not. He's not introduced as a rabbi, but he clearly knew he didn't clearly know his stuff, although it depends whether you say Rabbi Yosef was right in how he read the Mishna or not. Okay, it could be he had a different reading of the Mishna than Rabbi Yosef did. Now we're going to have Rav Papa and Rav Huna Bereit Rav Yoshua, who live next door to each other. Rav Papa havale hani dikle ametzre de Rav Huna Bereit Rav Yoshua. So Rav Papa had palm trees also on the border of Rav Huna Bereit Rav Yoshua, the border of his field. Now the issue is not going to be tree to vineyard. It's going to be a different issue, which is Azal Eshkache. So Rav Papa noticed one day, looking over in his neighbor's field, I guess, that Rav Huna was digging. This is Rav Huna Bereit Rav Yoshua, not the usual Rav Huna, although we see him a lot, Rav Huna Bereit Rav Yoshua, but from now on we'll just call him Rav Huna. He was cutting the roots of Rav Papa's tree. Amar lei, my hi. Rav Papa said, what are you doing? Amar lei, he says, what do you mean? It's not. It says in the Mishna, it says I can go 3 deep because I want my plow to go through and not to get stuck on, caught up on the roots. Amar lei, hani milish losha. So he says, okay, fine. Rav Papa says that's 3, but mar kachafir tfei. But you're digging deeper than 3. So Rav Huna says, Amar lei, ana barot shechinu ma'arot kachafarna. So he quotes in the next line in the Mishna. He says, oh, I'm digging to dig a ditch. And as it says, right? Different kind of pits, ditches, okay, in different shapes. Anyone who wants to dig for one of those, they can dig even farther as long as they need to dig the ditch. That's what I'm doing. Now, why didn't he say that in the first place? Why did he quote him the part of the Mishnah about the 3 tfachim? What, did he change his mind all of a sudden and say, I'm digging deeper and therefore, I'll use that excuse? Or maybe he was anyway digging a ditch and he just quoted the Mishnah to say, you know the rest of the Mishnah. So he just quoted the beginning part, really meant was the end part. Unclear about Rav Huna Bereit Rav Yoshua, whether he was really digging a ditch from the beginning, or once he got caught for digging too deep, he then made up, I'm digging for a ditch, and maybe then decided, okay, I'll dig a ditch. We don't really know. But anyway, then the Gemara continues and tells us what happened in the continuation of the story. Amar Rav Papa. Rav Papa now says, I kept bringing him argument after argument after argument, which the Gemara doesn't tell us what they were, but I couldn't win. Okay, Rav Papa kept trying to pull out this, and he would answer that, and pull out this, and he would answer that, and he kept trying to get him to stop doing it. We don't know what all that was. Moving now to Amud Bet. Ada Amrule, Hada Amarav Kahana, until I finally came up with, this is Rav Papa speaking, a good answer. And I said to him, and it's a bit weird answer, and in fact, the way Rashi goes, Tosfot has a big problem with it, and Tosfot has a whole different shot here, but we'll go with Rashi, so I'll just point out the difficulty that Tosfot raises, causes Tosfot to understand this differently, but here comes Rav Papa's claim. Ada Amrle Hada Amarav Yehuda, Netzach Shechziku Bo Rabim Asur Lekalkelo. Rav Yehuda said, if you have a boundary that already became, the public starts using it, and they become, becomes commonplace that everybody uses this, you can no longer, right, you can't destroy it and say, hey, this is mine, you can't use this anymore. So if there's, like, let's say, it's some boundary and people are putting things on it, let's say it's a little wall, you can't knock down the wall because people are using it to store things on. Once something becomes public property, you can't turn it back to be private property. So he says that's like this case. Why? Because my roots have been in your field already for a while. So if already I have rights, it's like I've taken over the part underground of your property and you don't have any rights to destroy it anymore. Okay? Like this is what you call the facts on the ground argument, which is going to be the big lead into the next chapter of Chezkat Abatim and Chezkat Shalosh Shanim. I've been eating the produce for 3 years. You can't now come and complain all of a sudden. What are you doing? So he says, I created facts on the ground and therefore you can't ruin it for me. And with that, he wins the argument. Now, the problem with this argument is there's a big difference between Rabim, the public taking over property, and a private individual. It's much more difficult. Like once the public starts using something and it becomes public property, you can't turn it back to private property. But you wouldn't necessarily say a thing with an individual. You could say to the individual, no, you don't have rights to this. So Rashi just says, even though he's a yachid, it's the same idea. Okay, even though he's an individual, you can still learn it from the public. Tosfot says there's no way. Those two different things. And Tosfot quotes the Rabbeinu Hananel and the Rivam, who have a totally different interpretation that we were actually talking about on the border. This border of Rav Huna was actually taken over by the public, and that's why Rav Huna had no right to basically get rid of the roots underneath. Anyway, it's a whole different shot, but we'll leave it at that right now. We'll stick with Rashi. And that seems to be the end of the discussion. However, as often happens to us, right? You're in the middle of an argument and then you don't think clearly enough, and only later you say, oh, should have said that. So after Rav Papa walks out winning this case, because he finally makes this last point, which works, Lebatar denafik, after he left, Amal, Rav Huna Bereder of Yeshua says, oh, wait, Amilo Amrele, why didn't I say to him the following thing? Kan b'toch 16 ama, kan chutz l-16 ama. There's a difference between the roots that are within 16 cubits of the tree and roots that are beyond 16 cubits of the tree. And this is going to really be the topic of the next section of our Gemara through today and even into tomorrow's daf, which is this measurement of 16 and how we get to this measurement of 16. But now we're going to learn that roots that are within 16 cubits of the tree are still considered connected to the tree and getting nourishment from the tree, passing nourishment onto the tree, all connected basically. Once you're beyond the 16 cubit mark, they're no longer really considered connected to the tree. And that's what Rav Huna could have said, which is, I'm digging up roots that are already distant 16 cubits from your tree. They're not even really considered yours anymore because they're already so far from the tree that they're not really getting anything or bringing anything to the tree. And therefore, I can cut them without a problem. And that could have been Rav Huna's retort. It doesn't tell us in the story, did he go back to Rav Papa? And, I don't think the Gemara really cares about what happened in the end of the story. The Gemara cares about the different arguments. And that's why they keep bringing all the different arguments of what everybody made and which one would win out over what. So in the end, the conclusion would be, if it's within 16 cubits of the tree, Rav Papa already had rights to that because it was facts on the ground. And Rav Huna wouldn't be able to uproot that even to dig a ditch. But if it's beyond 16 cubits, then already it's not really connected to the tree. It doesn't belong to Rav Papa anymore. Rav Huna could do what he wants with them. Now we're going to continue. Okay, it's not a direct connection to the 16 cubits, but we're going to start with a different sugya and then get back to the 16 cubits. And for that, we're going to have a whole bunch of diagrams or images that I created. The Mishna had said, right, if you're digging a ditch, you can dig down, you can take out the roots, no problem. And the roots are yours or his. Okay, who's his? We don't know. That's going to be the question. Ba'mine Yaakov hadiyaba merav chista. Eitzim shalmi. Who do the trees belong to? Amralei tanitua. Let's learn it from here, which is Shorshei ilan shel hadyot haba'im b'shel hekdesh lo nehenim velo moalim. Well, we have a Mishnah in Me'ilah. The Mishnah in Me'ilah says the following. If you have roots of a regular person, so me and my field is right here, and the roots of my tree go into a field next door, and the field happens to be haba'im b'shel hekdesh. They go into a field that was sanctified to the temple. Lo nehenim velo moalim. Well, you can't benefit from those roots because they're growing in the field of hekdesh, but the laws of Me'ilah don't kick in, which means it's not Torah law. This is a basic way of saying the rabbis forbade it, but it's not really forbidden by the letter of the law. Okay, if it was forbidden by the letter of the law, there would be Me'ilah, which means if someone used it without realizing, right, they would have to bring a sacrifice, they would have to replace the value. There's all these, so they would have to add an extra fifth. There's all these laws of Me'ilah. So again, my roots are going into the hekdesh field. Those roots are in a hekdesh field, but they're considered still mine. Because if they were considered hekdesh, and if we say it goes by the tree, the roots, even though they're in the next door field, mishum hachi lo mo'alin, that would explain why there's no Me'ilah, because they don't belong to the hekdesh. But if you say it goes by the ground, then amai lo mo'alin, then why is there no law of Me'ilah? So therefore they say elamai, okay, so period. Okay, so now they're going to assume that means it follows the tree. That's what this all seems to indicate. To which the Gemara says, wait a minute. Elamai, batar ilanas lina? You want to say it goes by the tree then? If that's what we just said. There's no laws of Me'ilah because the roots are in the hekdesh field, the sanctified field, but they grew in from my tree. And because there's no laws of Me'ilah, it must be it goes by the tree. But did you not read to the end of that Mishnah? The end of that Mishnah reads, Ema Seifa, Shel Hekdesh, the reverse case. What if it was a tree of Hekdesh? Haba'im b'shel hadyot, that go into the field of my field, a regular person. Also, lo nehenim velo mo'alim. It's the same law. Now, ibatar ilanas lina, and if we say it all goes by the tree, it came from a Hekdesh tree. Who cares if it's in my field? There should be laws of Me'ilah, right? Ibatar ilanas lina, namai lo mo'alim. So now they have to explain this Mishnah. It doesn't make any sense. Either we assume there's one of two possibilities. Either the roots follow the tree or the roots follow the ground. Either which way, one of the cases, there should be laws of Me'ilah because either it follows the tree or it follows the ground it's in. To which the Gemara said, Midi iria, begidulina be'im la'achar mikan askina, v'kasavar em Me'ilah begidulin. This is how you explain the Mishnah. This Mishnah has nothing to do with our topic. Does it follow the tree? Does it follow the ground? Why? Because what we're talking about is something that grew after it was sanctified. So let's give both cases. One is my tree. The roots grew into the field of hekdesh after the field was already sanctified. When a field is sanctified, now there's a halakhot about this, but kasavar ein Me'ilah begidulin. This Mishnah holds there's no Me'ilah in growths. Things that grow after, and as I sanctify a field, the field is sanctified, but anything that grows after that is not. So either we're talking about my roots from my tree grew into the field after the field was already sanctified. So that's not going to have laws of Me'ilah. By rabbinic law, we're going to say, okay, let's treat this as Me'ilah and don't benefit from it. But if you did, you're not going to be obligated the laws of Me'ilah. And in the other case, it would be that the field was sanctified, and after that, the tree was planted, or maybe the tree was planted, but the roots grew later. And we're talking about roots that grew later into the neighbor's field. So again, it was after the sanctification happened, and it's gidulim. There's no gidulim for Me'ilah. In which case, this has absolutely nothing to do with our topic, and we can't prove whether it follows the tree or follows the land. Okay, so we don't have an answer. But Ravina Amal, he resolves the contradiction in the Mishnah in Me'ilah, or the seeming contradiction, or doesn't make so much sense, the first part and the second part of the Mishnah, in a different way, which could answer our question, and which brings us back to the 16 cubits we talked about before. Ravina Amar lo kashya, kam b'toch sheshes le'ama, kam chutz l'sheshes le'ama, and what he's basically going to say, which is hard to read into the Mishnah, but that the Mishnah is discussing roots of different lengths, and that in the case where it comes from my field into the field of Hekdesh, we're talking that it was already more than 16 cubits away from, it was within 16 cubits of my field. Because it was within 16 cubits of my field, they're still considered mine. And then that answers our original question, which is if it's within 16 cubits of of my land in your property and you cut them, they go back to me because they're mine. And then the second part of the Mishna Me'ila, which is the roots from the hekdesh went into my field and it's not Me'ila, that's a case where it's beyond the 16 cubits. Beyond the 16 cubits, we no longer consider it connected to the tree. So what we say is like this, in our case, if it's within 16 cubits, it follows the tree. Beyond 16 cubits, it doesn't follow the tree. And then if you cut the roots, because it's in your field, you get to keep the roots because they're so distant from my tree that they're not considered mine anymore. And that would be the answer to the question, at least according to Ravina. And now, in light of what Ravina said, Ulla gives us a different halakha about this distinction of the 16 cubits. And then we're going to get to some mathematical equations about how exactly we understand the measurement of the 16 cubits and where do we get it from. So now the Gemara says the following. Amar Ulla, Ilan samuch lemetzal b'toch 16 ama gazlanu. If I plant a tree, a fruit-bearing tree, next to your field, and it's within 16 cubits of your field, my tree is considered a thief. Why is my tree considered a thief? Because my tree, those 16 cubits, right, because it's within 16 cubits, meaning less than 16 cubits away from your field, the roots we assume are going to go into your field. They're going to take nourishment from your field, and they're my roots, and it's forbidden. And since it's forbidden, or, it's like it's stealing, any fruits that grow from that tree are not going to be obligated in bikurim, okay? Laws of bikurim are bring the first fruits to the temple, and it's supposed to be from your land, it says, me'artzecha, from your own land you're supposed to bring. Now here it's not your own land, because it's part of these fruits are coming from your neighbor's land, and you've stolen them. You're not obligated in bikurim. Okay, that's the halacha. So he learns that halacha from this idea, basically, that within 16 cubits, it's nourishing enough. Okay, so now they want to know, minale le'ulaha. Where does Ulla get this from? And for this, I'm going to use the whiteboard feature here. And if you're not on the Zoom or the video, you can look at this. It's in by the summary of the daf on the website or in the podcast details, you should be able to find the photo. Okay, here we have our one tree, 16 cubits away from the border of a friend. Now, what they're going to assume here is that they're going to assume we're going to draw a square, okay? Later in tomorrow's daf, they're going to say, I don't know why you drew a square. It should have been a circle, okay? But right now, we're going to draw a square. Now, what is this square? This square is that and what it means is, in a box of 32 by 32, whoops, I just moved that, I didn't mean to do that. In a square area of 32 by 32, because again, if the tree, if you're not looking, I'll try to explain it in words. If the tree is distant 16 cubits from the wall of your neighbor, that means that it gets nourishment up to 16 cubits in all four directions, which then would create this big square. And you have 32 by 32 square amot, which is equal to 1,024 cubits. Okay, so you have 1,024 amot is 32 by 32. Basically, the assumption of Ulla and whoever else said 16 cubits is basically that a tree nourishes in a space of 1,024 square cubits. So now we want to see where we get that number anywhere else. And we're going to have a lot of trouble because we're never going to see that number anywhere else. We're going to maybe get close, and that's going to be what we're going to be satisfied with. But if you remember, the rabbis aren't exactly the most mathematical, even though there are a lot of mathematical equations there, but they often estimate it and things like that. So now we're going to start. So where does he get this from? So they're going to bring other Mishnah with other halakhot that relate to things nourishing from certain areas. So there's a Mishnah in Shemitah, Shvi'it, okay, Masechet Shvi'it, which talks about what you're not allowed to plow a field starting already from Pesach the year before, right? The 6 months before, because you would plow in order to plant the following year. And you're not going to plant in the Shemitah year, so you're not allowed from Pesach to start plowing a field. But there are certain things that are allowed. If you have these small sapling trees, then what you can do is you can plow if you have one small sapling, let's say this one, then you can plow around that tree up until even Rosh Hashanah, right up until Shemitah, because the tree really needs help before you're going to leave it for a whole year. Otherwise, it's not going to survive. And not only that, but if you had, and here goes our Mishnah, if you had 10 trees spread out evenly within a beit se'ah. Now, a beit se'ah, we're going to see, is 2,500 square amot. Okay. So now, this thing is blocking for me. I don't know if it's blocking for you. I can't move this. Okay. I don't know. There we go. Now it went off. So if you have, this is 2,500 square amot, this whole area of 10 netiot. If you have that, you're allowed to plow the entire space here, not just around each tree, but we assume, what does this mean? We assume that a space like this, every square cubit is being used to nourish one of the trees. So what does that mean? 2,500, we divide by 10. Each tree has, right, kama havulahu, how much do we have altogether? Trey up and b'chamesh mea garmide. Garmide is cubits, amot, it's the same thing. So altogether, again, this is just a known fact. A beit se'ah is 2,500 cubits. L'chol chad v'chad kama matele. So for each tree, because that's what we want to find out, how much does a tree get nourishment, right? How much does it need around it? 250 square cubits per tree. Okay, I don't even need to go any farther, but we'll do the math anyway. But that's 250, and this is 1,024. Right? If we want to get back to our 16 cubits, so what is it? The square root of 250 is 15.8. Divide that by 2, because again, that would be each side, and there's a whole side around the tree, the whole area. If we want to do, from the tree to each direction, it would be half that. That would be 7.9. 7.9 to 16 is, double basically, so, or half. So that wouldn't work. So let's try another source. Elami ditnan. We're only going to start this today, although I put all the calculations already up. If you have 3 large trees, these were small trees. You can see from the picture, these are large trees. 3 large trees in a space of a beit se'ah can all join together. Now, these aren't small, so we're not allowed to do them until Shavuot, until Rosh Hashanah. That's when the Shemitah year starts. But we are allowed to do this from Pesach to Shavuot. We'll allow this. And we'll allow not only to plow around each one, we'll allow you to plow the entire space, even though they belong to 3 different people. We'll view it as one field. Okay, I'll already kind of preview for tomorrow, and with this we'll finish. So if we want to divide 2,500 divided by 3, you have 833 square cubits. You're still not at 1,024. Okay, and again, what would this be? Square root of 833 is 28.8. Divide that into 2, you have 14.4. So again, the distance would be 14.4 and not 16. We're a lot closer, but we're not there yet. Okay, so that's what we'll get to tomorrow, and we'll see if we can figure out how we got to this 16 cubit length. Okay, that was our nice diagram. Okay, let's do a review of our daf. We started with the issue of the Bar Marion with the blowing, the stuff that blew in the wind, but it would blew from their combing. Is that considered giri didei of Rabbi Yosi or not? We had 2 different approaches. And then we compared it to Masechet Shabbat, and we compared also the issue with the spark. Then we got to the issue of the tree being distanced from another field, which would have trees, crops, or maybe vineyard. And then we said, well, tree to tree, vineyard to vineyard, but not tree to vineyard, because that would require more, as we saw in the story with Rabbi Yosi, who basically needed, right, the problem with the birds eating his grapes. And then the question is, if there's a fence, so you can put it all up against, because it was all about the plow, even though we learned there were other issues also. And then the issue with the roots, and what did we do with the roots? And then we had some stories about the roots. That was with Rav Papa and Rabbi Yoshua, and they're back and forth. And then we wanted to know who gets to take the roots. And in the end, at least if we go with Ravina, who explained the contradiction in some other way, right? The first way didn't really help us at all to get to an answer, but according to him, it all depends whether they're within 16 cubits or beyond 16 cubits from the tree. Beyond 16 cubits, they already belong to the owner of the land, and before 16 cubits, they belong to the owner of the tree. And then we got to this other halacha about the 16 cubits from Ulla that was in the same vein as Ravina, and then we tried to say, right, and that was with bikurim and basically stealing the nutrients, and therefore there's no laws of, you don't bring the bikurim to the temple. And then we tried to say, where does he get to the 16 cubits? And for that, we had all those mathematical equations, and we're still going to have to wait till tomorrow to figure this out. Wishing everyone a good day, Shavuot Tov, and Nishma B'Salat Tovat.